I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And I am live on location at the Silver Symposium in Las Vegas at Caesar's Palace. And I have joining me one of our newest contributors to the Prospector News, all the way from Manchester, England, Ted Butler. Welcome, Ted.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
It's good to meet you in person. And I understand this is your first time across the pond to America. What do you think of it so far?
It certainly is. I mean, it's certainly different. A lot of over exuberance in Las Vegas, but we've had a good time at the Mob Museum, and we've made a good time of it. So yeah, just glad to be here.
Yeah, over exuberance. I think that's probably the most polite way I've heard Vegas ever described. For those of you that aren't familiar with Ted, Ted is our newest contributor. He has contributed a wonderful article in our current edition, which can be found at theprospectornews.com, about resource nationalism and its rise, particularly in Africa. So tell us, Ted, what did you discover?
Yeah, so I think the key to understanding the situation in Africa lies in the fact that the economic foothold of France and the West more broadly has really reduced in the last few years, really. Back in 2000, France was the top import destination for the majority of African countries. And fast forward to today, in 2020, the reality is that China has now taken that role. It's responsible for over 70% of African imports. And the reality is what we're seeing is on the military front, we're seeing military coups all the way across Africa's Sahel region, which is West Africa, all the way from Guinea on the west coast to the east coast, more like Chad, Niger, all the way through that region. And essentially the international trade is heading towards the hands of the BRICS. And the military coups are a symptom of that.
I see. Yeah, France seems to be losing control of their former colonies, and they're starting to break away their ties from France. And it's starting to, particularly with Niger, which was France's largest uranium supplier, creating other geopolitical issues within that particular country. You talk about them moving towards more of the BRICS. Is Africa shifting away from the West increasingly so more to the BRICS, or are they going to be kind of a hybrid like the Middle East where they have a foot in both parties?
Well, the Middle East is a really important point that you raised there. I mean, the UAE, who have just joined the BRICS, the new BRICS Plus, they account for, 80 to 99% of the gold exported out of Niger, Guinea, Mali, and I forget the last one, Sudan, all goes to the UAE. So what we have is a situation where whoever owns gold has the power. And I think that whether you think that that's grounds for a gold-backed currency, I don't know. But it's certainly the fact that the gold is ending up in the hands of a BRICS nation. It certainly makes that argument stronger. It certainly makes it a possibility, especially when you look at what the Russian finance minister's been saying about gold 3.0. He recently released an article, last year, I think, depicting how he sees gold as part of a future gold-backed currency. And when you look at what's going on in the world with the absence of monetary clarity, with the dollar losing, it's currently strong at the moment, but in terms of the long-term picture, I don't see the dollar maintaining its strength. And I think as we play that out, we'll be searching for alternatives. And I think a gold-backed currency would present a sound one.
It's interesting. I find that the dollar is losing influence over the world, but it's still the world currency. So it's not going to die.
Yeah, it's the least dirty sheet.
It's the least dirty sheet, or the prettiest horse in the slaughterhouse, as Rick Rule likes to refer to it. What I find interesting is that the West African nations have found a trading partner outside of the U.S. dollar in the UAE. They have a lack of oil in those countries, and they need the oil for their energy purposes. And they also had a lack of US dollars in those countries, making it very difficult for them to buy to buy the oil that they needed.
Sure.
So being able to do this through gold, even though it's a BRICS related entity, it allowed them to get what they need with what they had. So to me, it was um, a step back towards the old-fashioned barter system, where I'm a pig farmer, I have pigs, and you're a chicken farmer and you have eggs, so I'll trade you some pork for eggs, kind of a system. And I'm seeing that more as a trading platform at this stage, rather than it being a sign that we're heading towards another currency.
I mean that's more of that plays out in the years to come. But as far as I'm concerned now, what we're seeing, especially in Gabon, which is the most recent military coup, Gabon's a huge oil producing nation. And for years, for decades, Omar Bongo and the Bongo dynasty in Gabon had been the family who'd maintained relationships with France. They gave favorable relationships with trade relationships with the French oil company Elf back in the 90s. And one of the most famous embezzlement cases, millions and millions of dollars paid off to Omar Bongo. I think it was $20 million annually. And that's all come to an end because they don't have an economic foothold in Gabon anymore, because the main trade partners of Gabon are now China, India, UAE.
So the influence of the West in Africa has been more European influence rather than American influence.
Particularly, yes. Yeah. I mean, the US, so most recently in Niger, the US has a military base there. It has about 1,100 troops there. Its troops are still there as we speak. But as far as France is concerned, just a few days ago, its 1,500 troops were kicked out of France, or withdrawn from Niger.
Kicked out.
But this is the story across all of Africa. This is the story across Mali, Burkina Faso, and the interesting thing is the presence of the Wagner forces. Whether they are the catalyst for these coups or whether they are simply there to lap up the benefits is difficult to say. But what is clear is that throughout the whole of Africa's Sahel region, particularly in Sudan, in Mali, in the Central African Republic, which is not in the Sahel region, but it's slightly lower, the Wagner forces have a huge position there. And if you actually look at the map as to where this position is being formed, it runs all the way through the region to the point where it goes from Guinea all the way to the other side, towards the UAE, Saudi Arabia. So there's a potential ability there for a trade route, is what I'm trying to say.
So if we're seeing Africa move towards the BRICS away from the West, it's going to start in this region and spread through the rest of the continent.
Africa is a battleground for resource wars right now, and it's obviously had a turbulent past, and it's been the victim of colonialism. But the thing is, those practices still exist today, in the form of financial aid. I mean, just because it's not as blatant as slavery, the financial aid keeps Africa trapped within the West's economic shackles. I mean, just look at the uranium deal that Niger was getting with France. I mean, it was 80 cents per kilo.
No, good deal for France.
Oh yeah, but I don't think it's come to an end. But they were paying 200 euros per kilo to their other trading partners. So the fact that the discrepancy there is unbelievable, and it just shows that when Africa are presented with an alternative that's offering investment, I mean, you look at the Chinese state oil company, they're building a pipeline from Niger to Benin. They're supposedly going to tap into 1 billion barrels of oil reserves that are yet untapped. They're also building a 17-mile expressway in Kenya, right the way through Nairobi. So what you're seeing is Africa's loyalty is being bought by the BRICS, and the approach of financial aid by the West is no longer viable.
Yeah, I've noticed this, and we talk about the colonization that's occurred in the past, and I'm a big believer in that you make the pie bigger and everyone's slice of the pie becomes bigger because of it.
Sure.
So I'm not a zero sum person where in order for one person to win, the other person has to lose. And what I see in resource nationalism is a situation where the countries are now trying to get value for their resources,
Sure.
which all the power to them, they should.
Yeah.
And that's not just limited to Africa, it's occurring in South America. But the point that I wanted to ask about is that given the history of colonization, and I understand they want to, shed themselves of the shackles of that, but are they just trading one colonizer for another? China is not necessarily, nor Russia necessarily neutral countries.
That's absolutely
They're
correct. Yeah.
colonizers as
Yeah.
well.
No, they're almost just as bad as each other in some sense. The thing with China, though, is their position is compromised by their economic situation. I mean, the 272% debt to GDP. So how long can this continue? I mean, I'm not particularly well versed in the Chinese economy, but I do know that it's in a precarious position. And that certainly influences its ability to maintain control in Africa. I mean, the thing is, it's not as black and white as the BRICS are taking control and the West is losing. I mean, there are areas of Africa where the West has a stronghold. For example, Nigeria, ECOWAS, which is the kind of governing body for the West African states. Nigeria is a huge voice within that, and Nigeria, some would argue, is in the pocket of the West. So it's not as black and white. And you look at Ghana, and after that, you have Mali, which is the 11th top gold producer in the world. After that, you have Sudan in Africa, which is the 16th top gold producer in the world. And Ghana is the only real one in the gold producing nations, which is Western linked, if you see what I mean.
I understand. Although even then, Ghana has taken and realized that they can't get US dollars to buy oil with, and they're trading with Saudi Arabia, who is also sitting on that kind of BRICS fence playing both sides.
Yeah.
They're trading gold for oil there,
Yeah.
And using the same barter system as the countries that are leaning towards the BRICS.
Sure.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, instead of us using the U.S. petrodollar as the West to trade with these countries, we should be more open to trading in their commodities for the items that they actually need.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, obviously the BRICS are doing it in a different way. They're transitioning first to local currencies before they make the jump to a gold-backed currency or whatever. But certainly trading in commodities, yeah. I mean, it's more of a efficient way, perhaps you could argue. It's more of a pure way. Is it the right way? I don't know, but yeah, it's certainly an interesting point.
Yeah, so you see Africa as a battleground in an economic way, hopefully not in a physical way, but
Sure.
between the the BRICS and the Western influence. Do you see Africa going one direction versus another? Will it be some countries will be in one direction, others in another, or do you see it like, as I say, like the Middle East, which they're kind of members of both clubs?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the balance of power is shifting towards the BRICS in Africa. And I think I can see it continuing that way for the foreseeable future. France is reliant, France needs Africa more than Africa needs France, because France doesn't really, 30, a huge proportion of its electricity production relies on uranium. I think this might be incorrect, but I think it's over 60% of the total electricity production in France is nuclear. So what you have there is uranium is an essential part of that. Niger was one of its main partners, and it no longer has the military presence in Niger to command the economic situation. So Niger is a great example.
The question then is, will France lose access to that uranium, or will they just have to pay for a price?
Well, this is a great point for the Uranium bull cycle, because you have a situation where the West's access to uranium particularly France's access to uranium, is becoming limited, and so it has to search for uranium from other people. So what happens there is there's an increased scarcity on the west part, which is an upward price pressure, arguably.
Yes, I see that. Now, we've talked almost exclusively with Africa.
Sure.
How does that spill over into other potential BRICS areas, such as, say, South and Central America?
Yeah. Well, Mexico isn't a BRICS country, but it's certainly an area where resource nationalism is becoming prevalent. You've got the Lopez Obrador, the president there. He's very socialist. Obviously, lithium nationalization has been an interesting policy. I think that's going to continue in Mexico. I don't think it'll spill over to silver, personally, because I think it's too important. And I don't think that they would be naive enough to restrict access to that. I think we may see, if he's called AMLO, if we see him get another term, he may decide to do that. But I think I see Mexico as an area where resource nationalism could grow, but I would exclude silver from that.
Would that be actually possible in Mexico, given their membership in NAFTA?
Possibly not. Possibly not. Another area, though, where resource nationalism isn't taking place, particularly, or potentially with the new presidential election of Javier Milei, potentially, we could see Argentina kind of excluded, almost the anomaly to the trend of resource nationalism across Latin America. Javier Milei, if you don't know, is a libertarian. He's hugely optimistic about abolishing the central bank completely. I mean, of course, as you well pointed out to me, Argentina, it depends on the provinces and the political states in the provinces. But I do think that with a libertarian president, the openness to trade and the openness to investment in the mining industry in Argentina would make it an anomaly to the trend of resource nationalism, which is taking Latin America and Africa.
Interesting. Do you think that that will be a pushback to the other countries if Argentina starts to thrive?
Well, it should do. I mean, the only country that I've really seen benefit from resource nationalism in recent years was Indonesia with its nickel. But I wonder whether that's because it's the amount of nickel that it has is so plentiful and abundant that it can afford to do that. I don't know, but wherever you look, there's no real evidence that resource nationalism is a successful policy. It's counterintuitive in a sense because it blocks off investment, which, as we know, investment creates job opportunities, and the government is not it is a bottomless pit. They treat it like a bottomless pit, government spending, but the reality is that it's not as effective and as efficient as private funds, in my opinion.
No, although I can't speak for Africa, but I do see that in the movement towards resource nationalism, at least in South America, it's about keeping the resources in the country in order to create a manufacturing base. So
Sure.
I almost wonder if resource nationalism in Central America or in South America is actually not going to end up being a pro-Western type of event, as opposed to Africa, which is a pro-BRICS, in that as we move away from manufacturing in China, and assuming we don't try and completely reshore it back to America and Canada, that we're not going to see us offshore that rather to South American countries instead of Asian countries going forward. What's your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, the reason why, I guess, American manufacturing took a huge, substantial drop throughout the last 20, 30 years. And arguably that's what's driven the decoupling from China. And I think that decoupling effect on China, because we as the West have become so dependent on China and Russia for that matter. And this decoupling away from China and Russia has created this reverberating effect of resource nationalism across Africa. They're basically looking to the global superpowers, and they're seeing America decouple as much as it can from China, almost incrementally, but it's a gradual process, but it is happening. And they're looking to these global superpowers and they're thinking, well, if you're doing it, then me too, you know. So it's this kind of, whether it's the paranoia from coronavirus or whatever's sparking this desire to reshore production, it's certainly happening. I mean, Chile is one of the worst resource nationalism areas. I mean, it's obviously notoriously rich in its lithium, and their president's a very young guy, he's 38, and he's absolutely hell bent on nationalising, from what I understand. And I just don't see that that's an effective policy in terms of attracting investment. I mean, there's two companies in Chile mining lithium, isn't there?
Yeah. But yeah, it's it's going to produce challenges that way. But as I say, like if we look at, although Argentina is probably a poorer choice, but you see companies like Stellantis, which is the old Chrysler, Chrysler Auto Group. They're investing heavily in offtakes into nationalized resource companies in Argentina, because they're going to build some of their battery manufacturing in Argentina, and then they're going to intend to ship that off to their plants in North America and in Europe. So that's where I say I think that the nationalism it may curb investment in one area, but actually spark investment in another area in that particular, for those particular reasons, because those Western companies are still going to need those resources somewhere.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one thing's for sure is the growing trend of resource nationalism is increasing the bull case for the commodities supercycle, in my opinion. I mean, it's making the natural resources that we need less accessible, in my opinion, because there's less private investment coming in to mine the metals and the minerals. And so that creates more of a supply issue. And that, provided that the demand is high, which it is, as we've seen from this supposed green energy transition that is looking likely, as much as I would potentially disagree with that, the direction of it and the speed of it at the expense of, like outlawing the production of oil and gas. I think that's a foolish thing to do. But the green energy transition, it seems like they're going ahead with it. The Inflation Reduction Act we've seen in the US, and provided that demand is there, the resource nationalism creating the issues for supply, I mean, it's a recipe for higher prices, in my opinion.
Definitely. And I think it also creates opportunity in countries such as, well, in North America, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, which can work collectively. But we have other issues with permitting and things of that nature that's holding back our resource sector here. Even though Canada is supposed to be a free trading country, has started to dip their toes into resource nationalism by barring Chinese ownership of Canadian mining companies. It's going to be an interesting thing. I think the world, as we have known it for the last 40 years, is changing, and it's changing rapidly. You did mention COVID. I don't think COVID started it, but I think COVID has put a brick on the, pardon the, after I said brick, the obvious, choice of words on the accelerator and moving the world forward to this deglobalization and resource nationalism. I want to thank you for taking the time. It's good to meet you in person. I look forward to more thoughts and articles and perceptions as this starts to roll out and have more effect on all of our lives. So,
I mean, I just want to leave one lasting thought, is that the world will realize that resource nationalism is ineffective, and ultimately it will revert back to private investment when it realizes that that's what it needs to drive investment to get the minerals and metals that we need. So that's just my conclusion.
Well, at least that's an optimistic look. The speed at which that's going to happen.
Oh no, it'll take time. say so. Sure.
Yeah, I think these are generational moves, and
Sure.
yeah, I think you're right in the long run, but in the short run, we're
stuck for a
we're
while.
we're stuck
Yeah.
we're stuck in this for a while.
Yeah.
You can read Ted's article again on our September edition of the Prospector News, which can be found at the prospectornews.com. Give it a read. Subscribe to that. Like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you're hearing this podcast. And thanks very much for joining me, Ted.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.